This session is Turfgrass 101, Back to the Basics, presented by Dr. Greg Munshaw. Did I get it right? All right. So he doesn't want me to do everything, but Dr. Greg's been in the turfgrass industry for 30 years, and he's a pretty good dude. So, all right, let's welcome Dr. Greg. Thank you.
I don't know if I'm a pretty good dude or not. That might be stretching it a little bit, but I'll go with that. So Jason said, I got to run, I got to pee, so don't feel bad that I'm leaving. Where are the bathrooms in this place? I have seriously looked high and low, literally looked before coming in here, and so if I have to run it halfway through, you know what's going on. I'm looking for stinking bathrooms. Do Utah-ians not pee? I don't get it. I don't know. So anyways, does this seem really loud or is it all right? It's okay? Okay. I feel I'm getting a lot of noise up here. Okay, so simplicity. That's my kind of take on turf management. If you're looking for something mind-blowing out of today's talk, go next door. I'm going to give the basics as I see them, the things that you've got to do on an annual basis to make sure that your grass is healthy. And that's really it. I mean, the things that are necessary, complete necessities to make sure that you're going to make it through the year. And your grass is obviously going to do well. And so we'll talk about all sorts of different things, but, you know, it is certainly basics. All right. So, how did we get where we are? Was there some supreme being that said, boom, there's grass? Or was there some kind of a transition from something to something to something over time? I wasn't there. Either way you look at this, though, they're a huge leap of faith, right? I mean, whichever way you believe, they're a huge leap of faith. So, anyways, I'm not here to convince you one way or the other, but obviously something happened at some point to give us grass as we have it today. Apparently this thing does not work. So what about this? We are turf managers, right? Why are we turf managers? Why is grass the plant that we grow? What about it? Why is it the one that we grow?
It looks good.
It looks good. Okay, we'll go with that. You heard it from yesterday, all right. Yeah, so I gave a abridged version of this yesterday. So there's no batteries in this thing. No wonder it doesn't work. Jeez Louise. So, it looks good. What else?
It's durable.
Durable? Okay. What else? Man's triumph over nature. That's a good one. I'm not sure that we control it all the time as it controls us, but I like that. Anything else? It is absolutely multifunctional. Can you ask these guys for some batteries? All right. What about this? If our playing surfaces were covered in daisies, could we play sports on those fields? So football would be interesting, right? I mean, you'd probably get slowed down. There'd probably be some tripping and whatever. Could you play soccer? Be interesting, right? Ball maybe sit on top of that, tee it up for whoever's kicking it or whatever. But could you mow those flowers down? Could you mow them down and make it tight like our grass and then just play on the cut off flower stems? Why not? Why couldn't we do that? Might be stocky and hard and cut you up if you fell on them, right? But what's the issue with this? With most of the plants in the world, the growth point is at the very top of the plant. And so if you mow off that top, the apical meristem up there, you're mowing off the growth point. There are other meristems that cause that plant to spread out. But if you keep mowing lower and lower, you're going to cut off all of those growth points and you're not going to have a growth point. And so that plant can't recover. And so eventually, if we mow short enough on any one of these kind of plants, it's not going to recover. It's going to die. Grasses, on the other hand, grow from the bottom up. Because they grow from the bottom up, we can mow them. And so new tissues, new cells are being produced at the crown of the plant, basically at the soil level, being pushed up. We mow off the tip, which is literally the oldest part of the leaf, and the plant is fine, right? So it's a wound, it's an injury, just like this horse doctor, grass doctor is saying here, but it's just a wound. The plant will recover from it, whereas most other plants out there wouldn't. And so how did grasses get to be like this? Was it a zap, there's grass, and it grows just like that? Or was it an adaptation or evolution over millions of years that, I don't know. But whatever the case is, we have this plant that grows different from every other plant that's out there. All right, so we've got these grasses. What should we grow in different places? Who's from the north here? A few people. South? Transition zone? A whole bunch from the transition zone. Not sure? Or other, maybe? All right, so guys up north, guys and gals up north, what are you growing? Is it mostly Kentucky bluegrass? Anybody growing perennial ryegrass up north? Yeah, a few people. How far up north are you? New Hampshire, okay. East Coast. That's pretty far up north. Who else is growing perennial rye? How far up are you guys? Utah, okay. All right. Seattle, okay. So we see usually more bluegrass, especially as we go farther and farther north, because it has better cold tolerance, right? And so ryegrass has its issues in the heat, but it also has its issues when it gets cold. And so even though it's a cool season grass, it doesn't have the cold tolerance of other cool season grasses. And so it works for a lot of different things, but it's not the be-all end-all like Kentucky bluegrass is. What about tall fescue? Anybody growing tall fescue on athletic fields? One? Okay. So why not tall fescue? So be honest, when you think about tall fescue, do you think of Kentucky 31 generally? Big, ugly, open, light green? That's kind of what most people think. They what? Okay. Apparently batteries are hard to come by. So the new tall fescues, if you've not paid any attention to breeding over the last 15 years, the new tall fescues that are out there today, they have crazy heat tolerance. And so if you live anywhere where it's warm, it's a great grass to think about. They've got much improved cold tolerance. And that was one of the issues that we had in years past. They didn't stack up to Kentucky bluegrass. But today's tall fescues will make it in Michigan and Minnesota, places that get a severe winter. Thank you. And so the other thing with tall fescues is, back in the day, we'd mow them at 3 inches. And how many athletic fields are mown at 3 inches, right? Not a whole lot. But today's tall fescues are handling 1 inch or less. And so tall fescues are grass to look at. I don't know what just happened here. Apparently the guys in the back were screwing with me. All right. So, does this thing even work now? Apparently not. I don't have a clue. So anyways, in the south, right, Bermuda grass. Anybody growing anything other than Bermuda grass in the south? Right, so that's our grass of choice, right, because it's a tank. Absolute beast. It recovers, it takes a beating, it's got great footing for athletes. There's a whole bunch of reasons to like Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is so good that we're seeing it creep up farther and farther north. Chicago Bears, Bermuda grass this year. Just blows my mind. How is Bermuda grass surviving places like Chicago? But some of these new Bermuda grasses, and I'm not sure that I would gamble on something like that if I was the field manager that far north, but folks are believing in this stuff, right? So we're seeing grasses that typically weren't growing in different places before showing up in new places. What about all those hands in the transition zone? What are you growing? A little bit of everything. Bermuda, fescue, and ryegrass. All together in different fields. See, that's the best way to do it. Just throw it down and whatever survives, survives, right? You want to keep it simple? That's keeping it simple. So that's the tough thing about the transition zone, right? I mean, it's the one place on the planet where we can grow all grasses equally poorly. And that's a tough thing to do. I mean, all grasses struggle in the transition zone, either with the cold of the winter or the heat of the summer. And so you see a lot of Bermuda grass there, but you see some bluegrass, you see some fescue, you see some ryegrass. And so there is some bending of these zones, but a lot of times, we have our cool seasons up north, we have our warm seasons in the south. All right, identification. This is something that, you should spend a little bit of time each week on, just doing some basic ID stuff. Learning the grasses that you're growing, learning the weeds that are on your fields. If you don't know the grasses that you're managing, how do you know what heights they can stand, how much fertilizer they need, what chemicals you can apply to them, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't know the weeds that are on your site, you don't know which chemicals you should be using. Okay, it's a broadleaf. I know I can put out 2,4-D or whatever for this broadleaf weed, but obviously 2,4-D does not get every broadleaf weed that's out there. And so with identification, and thanks to the guys in the back, you've already seen all those stuff, but we need to look at different parts of the grass plant to figure out how to identify them. And so when I'm IDing things, if there's a seed head up there, that's the first thing that I'll look for. But what do we do a lot in turf? We mow. And so what happens to that seed head? It's gone. And so we don't have a seed head to use most of the time. And so if that's not there, obviously you've got to skip down to the next thing. One of the next things I look for is the new leaf that's kind of coming up right up the middle of the plant. It's called vernation. And it's going to be rolled or folded in half, just like a book. And the one that I've got a picture of there is tall fescue. You can kind of see how it's unraveling. It's rolled. And so look for that. In a bigger plant, it's easy to see. In a small plant like an ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass or just even a fine textured Bermuda grass or bent grass or something like that, it's harder to see. Ligule is another thing that I'll look at where the mature leaf bends away from the stem, and you can see the ligule right there, a membranous ligule. We've also got hairy ligules, or ligules can be absent. The lateral stems, stolons and rhizomes are another thing to look for identification. Good things to look at. And with our lateral stems, there's even differences. Like I get people getting confused between Bermuda grass and zoysia grass. There's similarities there, right? And so if you pull up a stolon, that zoysia grass stolon branches out at 90 degrees with each new shoot that's coming off of that stolon or rhizome. And with Bermuda grass, they come off at 45 degrees. And so things like that, little tips and tricks that you can learn to identify grasses just makes it a heck of a lot easier. Sometimes you can even skip some of these things like ligule and vernation and go right to what matters. Sometimes we'll see at the base of the plant down by that crown, purpling. And some grasses have it, some grasses don't. Like bluegrass does not have purple, ryegrass does. And so if you're confused between those two, look for the purple and you'll know that it's not bluegrass. All right, here's a shameless plug for my YouTube channel. I do a lot of grass ID stuff. I taught for a whole bunch of years, and if you're wanting to learn how to identify grasses, there's just some basic videos on, and this one I'm showing here is just an overall, all those plant parts that I was just talking about. All right. When you put one of these signs out, what do parents think? Are they super excited? Everybody loves to see a pesticide sign, right? You're killing my kids. You're killing my dog. Because everybody takes their dog to your fields to run. Because it's a dog park, right? But do you ever see people happy with a pesticide sign? Heck no. Not a chance. All right? So I am not a tree hugger. I use chemicals on my research farm. It's just, one of those things that we have to do. But the world is changing. And if you don't get on board with the change, you're going to get left behind. If you look at what's out there in terms of chemicals, fertilizers, water, this is the stuff that's changing. This stuff is getting cracked down on. So we're seeing water restrictions. We're seeing pesticide bans. We're seeing fertilizer bans. The stuff that we've had to use for years and years and years is going away. The stuff that we use to make our athletic fields recover, we're not going to have in the not too distant future. So what do? Right? It's back to basics. We've got to do the things right that maybe sometimes we skip over because they're a hassle. The worst one of all these things up here is Montgomery County, Maryland. Everybody familiar with Montgomery County? Those guys are, yeah. So Montgomery County is literally the craziest place on the planet in terms of pesticides and maybe with everything, but I know for pesticides and that sort of thing for sure. So a buddy of mine that's a turf manager there literally can't apply anything to his fields. How do you maintain those fields? Right? He can't fertilize. He can't apply pesticides. How do you do it? Right? You figure it out. You go back to basics. But their slogan in Montgomery County, Maryland for lawn care is, we're not raising grass, we're raising families. That's just the dumbest thing that, I mean, maybe people are buying it in that county, but come on, that's just ridiculous. Anyways, get on board because whether you like it or not, this is our future. All right. So, this is it. It's this simple. Everything that you need to grow grass is literally there for you. Maybe not the green thumb, and sometimes, I struggle with different plants, but everything else, it's free. It's there. Maybe the water comes and goes, but our light, our air, the temperature, if it's right, obviously plants are going to grow. Soil is there, so we've got at least some nutrition in the soil. And so it's pretty simple if you think of this is what plants have to have. All the extra things that we're doing, do they need it? Maybe, maybe not. Let's talk about some things. All right, so like I said, simple is good in my books. And I've grown grass for a lot of years, and this is the way I do it, right? I'm not the brightest person on the planet. I'll be totally open with you. And I've got to break these things down to make it simple for me to understand. And if the grass survives on the simple things that I'm doing, even with beating it up and doing whatever that we're doing to it, then I think it's a possibility that it could work for you guys too. All right, so let's briefly talk about photosynthesis. Right? This is the absolute miracle of the planet. If this didn't happen, none of us would be here. Right? There's an enzyme in here called ribisco that takes carbon dioxide out of the air that we exhale and turns it into sugar in a plant because of sun shining on leaves. It's just mind-blowing. So, carbon dioxide plus water out of the soil, carbon dioxide out of the air, sun energy creates sugar, and then we get oxygen as a byproduct. Do we need oxygen for anything? Yeah, maybe a couple things. So obviously just a benefit there, right? So simple reaction, whole bunch of processes going on in the plant to make this happen. That sugar that's made, though, is literally sent all over the plant for storage. And so like warm season grasses that are surviving through the wintertime when they're dormant are living off of these stored sugars. But growth during the rest of the year is from the sugar that's being produced during photosynthesis. So when we get new roots being produced and roots elongating, it's because of the sugar that's produced in the leaf. And so it's a hugely, hugely important process. All right. And so obviously there's some things that can put a wrench into photosynthesis. So drought. All right. Do we ever get drought? Obviously we do, right? Especially if you live in the West. So in this photosynthesis process, water is needed. The light reactions, when light is accepted by the chlorophyll, water is split, and the hydrogen is used in that reaction. So we have to have water. Other things to think about. On the bottom side of leaves, we've got these little pores called stomates. They open and close throughout the day. So at night they're closed. In the morning they open. When it gets hot and dry, they close. And so if it's hot and dry where you are, what are these stomates doing? Closed up. How much carbon dioxide is getting into the leaf if this pore is closed? None. All right, so if you don't have carbon dioxide coming into that cool season grass leaf, how much sugar is being made? None. So if you don't have sugar being made, how much energy you're producing for growth? None, right? So this is a big deal that these stomates open and close. So when it's hot and dry, stomates close up. All right? Shade is another thing to think about. So this is the University of Louisville soccer field. Beautiful complex. And they built this thing to keep the people in the stands comfortable during matches. Great idea, right? What happens to the grass along that edge of the field? It's horrible, absolutely horrible. He has to cut it out and replace it every year because grasses don't grow very well when there's shade. So here's just the same two plants, one grown in light, one grown in shade. We can see how much more photosynthesis is happening, obviously because there's more sunlight. So, things to think about. Pay attention to your soil. If you're moist, obviously you're in pretty good shape. The water that we need for photosynthesis is coming out of the soil. Shade, plants are slowing down typically in shade, not growing as much. Sometimes we see them elongate like crazy to try and find some light, but eventually they just grow themselves to death. But they thin out, they get ugly and ornery. Back off on what you're doing to those areas to try and help them along a little bit. And then with C3 grasses, if it's crazy hot, try and improve air movement a little bit if you can. Hard to do. And then syringe. What would syringing do to a field? Knock the temperature down, right? And so we're knocking the heat down a little bit, so maybe we can open those stomates back up. All right, so there's a huge difference between warm season grasses and cool season grasses. Warm season grasses are way more efficient than cool season grasses. Cool season grasses have this process called photorespiration. And it's absolutely wasteful. So when those stomates close, carbon dioxide is not coming into the leaf. We have this photorespiration thing going on where the plant actually wastes carbon dioxide and wastes energy. So no new sugar being made and a waste of other things. All right. Warm season grasses don't have this. And so it's all good. But this cycle where we're making sugar, carbon dioxide comes in, but oxygen can also come in there. So when the stomate's closed, the carbon dioxide that's in the leaf gets used up, oxygen's what's left. And then this cycle starts happening more and more and more as it gets hot and dry. And so why are my fields struggling in the summertime? Bingo. You've got this cycle called photorespiration happening where the plant is not producing energy because it's not making sugar, as much sugar through photosynthesis. And so we've got to baby our plants along. And so we see things like this on golf courses a lot, right, to help with this process. Cool the plants down to try and get those stomates to open and let some more carbon dioxide in the leaf. All right, let's switch gears to soils here, and we'll spend a little bit of time on soils and making sure that we're in good shape with our soils. So I'm a big believer in soil health, and a few years ago at this meeting I gave a presentation on that, just healthy soil, healthy turf, something like that. But really what we're talking about with soil health is all the critters that live in the soil, all the microbes. So if you've got good populations of microbes in your soil, typically that means your soil is pretty healthy. What does that mean for you? It means your grasses are going to grow better, right? We're going to have a much better surface if we've got good soil. So you get a disease on your grass, what do? How do you take care of that disease? Spray a chemical, right? Fungicide. All right. What does a fungicide do? What is it targeting? Microorganisms, right? The fungus that causes the disease in the plant. And so are there other microorganisms in the soil other than fungi? Sure there are. And so when we apply fungicides, a lot of times we are affecting the biology of the soil, killing it with these products. And again, I'm not a tree hugger, but we need to think about what are we doing? What's the big picture of the things that we're doing? So soils, whole bunch of stuff going on there. We've got living things, dead things. There's gases in there, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. We've got water and nutrients, obviously. And then one of the big things with our soil is that it just anchors our plants. Can you grow grass without soil? Obviously, there's hydroponics and stuff that people are doing that works just fine. But in our situation, obviously, we need soil to anchor things. So knowing what kind of soil you have can be helpful to know how is my soil going to react to drainage, how's it going to react to fertility, things like that. And so figuring out what is your soil, going to the textural triangle and figuring out I've got a silty clay loam or a sandy loam or whatever it is. You can do some of this stuff. You can send it off to a lab. And if you're really sandy, probably want to do that because you probably don't have these sieve plates in your home. But you can do it all by yourself if you want to buy these things. I don't know if Amazon sells them or whatever, but probably somebody does. But if you've got a native soil or something that's at least similar to a native soil, you can just put a scoop of your soil into a jar, fill it up with water, give it a shake, and let things settle out. What's going to settle out first? Sand, heavy, right? Then silt is next, and then clay on top. And then you'll have some organic and stuff floating in the water on the top. And then you can figure out, based on how big those layers are versus the height of everything, what percentages of sand, silt, and clay you've got in your soil. And then go to the textural triangle to find out what is my soil. And so, that's a pretty simple thing, and that's what I do. I've done this ribboning before, and that just tells me kind of, is it clay or is it not, right? If the longer the ribbon that you have, the more clay that's in it, the more sand that you have, the more likely it's just going to break off and fall over top of your finger. But the jar test is pretty good and pretty easy to do. Do it with your kids. There's a science project for your 6th grade kid. I got nothing. All right. So, differences between sand and clay. All right. So, a lot of times we're growing grasses on sandy fields when we get up to the high levels. But at Parks and Rec and high schools and all of these different places, we're playing on native soils. And so let's look at a little bit between what's going on with sand and clay soils. So sand, large particles, clay, not large at all. Sands don't hold nutrients, clays do pretty well. Sands don't compact too bad, clays do. Sands don't hold water, clays hold water like crazy. Sand, water will move through pretty easily. There's not a whole lot, there's a big pores in there, not a whole lot to slow it down. Clays, obviously, that doesn't happen. Water doesn't move through them very well at all. And in sands, because of the big pores, we've got a lot of air spaces. Right? I just told you that roots take that sugar from photosynthesis and make energy for growth. Right? There's a process called respiration. We're all doing it right now, right? We're breathing in oxygen and we're breathing out carbon dioxide. Our cells take that oxygen and convert sugars that we've had for breakfast into energy for us to move or whatever we're doing. And so that's respiration. We get rid of CO2 as our waste product. Roots are doing that. And so we got to have oxygen in our root zones for roots to be able to grow. So regardless of what kind of field you're growing on, organic matter could be a big benefit to you. If you've got a very sandy medium that you're dealing with, organic matter is going to give you water and nutrient holding capacity. So one of the places that I'm consulting on right now was built with zero organic in the sand. It's 100% sand field. And I had nothing to do with the construction of it, but I inherited it. And so how do you manage that, right? Water just shoots right through. Nutrients just shoot right through. The grass is struggling. They've lost the grass, and that's when I got the call. But it's a tough situation. We got to have something to hold on to these things in our soil. With our clayey soils, we get aggregation. And so aggregation is just when clay particles, these tiny little bits, get stuck together into bigger chunks, more like a sand-sized particle, where we can get air spaces and water moving down through the soil. So this is our perfect world with soils. Yes, sir?
You mentioned organic matter. What's an ideal amount of organic matter?
And that's a good question. What's the ideal amount of organic matter? You're going to get to a point like this, even this field that I'm dealing with that has none. It's a Bermuda field. It's going to get crazy amounts at some point. But right now, it has none. And so if I'm at that about 4% organic matter range, I'm pretty happy. So this image here shows you 5%. And so somewhere in that ballpark. But this is in our perfect world. This is what our soil looks like, right? We've got 45-ish% soil, 5%-ish organic, and then the rest is open for water and air to be in our soil. But as soon as we start having kids run across that field and mowers zipping around and stuff, what happens to this? What happens to that air and water space? It pushes together, right? So we have less and less air and water space and more solids. Right? Is that a good thing? Not so much, right? So this image is by far the best illustration of what compaction does to our plants. Right? So no compaction, look at the root system down through here, down to the bottom of this test tube, plant's doing great. A little bit of compaction, we've got roots right here stopping, and plant's doing okay, but not obviously as good as no compaction. High compaction, we've got roots right here, and the plant is struggling. It's kind of a big deal, right? So when you're walking your fields and you're like, why is this field struggling so bad? I've fertilized it, I've watered it, et cetera, et cetera. What's going on? Well, maybe it's something like this that you can't see as easily as some other issues like diseases or whatever. So like I said, we've got to have oxygen in our soil because we've got to have that energy produced for root growth. We want to get rid of carbon dioxide and other gases that are produced in the soil as waste. And so we want to get that out of there and oxygen in. And then all those microbes that we want in our soil have to have oxygen as well. So we need to have gases moving in and out of the soil and not just capped off. The harder that soil is, the less gases we're going to have moving in and out. All right. So obviously pretty easy fix on some of this stuff, right? Airify. Going to take care of our compaction, going to take some thatch out of there. We're going to get oxygen in the soil. And then if we are low oxygen and it's not compaction, is it a drainage thing? You know, that could be something that could be looked at. So, do you need to aerify? Kind of depends, right? How often is that field being used? If it's used all the time, like probably most of you guys have to deal with, you're probably going to need to aerify maybe a couple of times, maybe 3 times a year, depending on how much traffic you're getting. So, one of these things obviously is going to tell you if it's compacted or not, just a penetrometer. A knife, using your thumb to push a knife blade into the soil is a good test of how hard the soil is. If you can push it in but just with your thumb moving and not pushing down with your arm, it's probably not compacted. But just, you know, I've got to the point where I can walk across a hard surface and I feel that it's hard. If you feel a cushion and stuff, you know, it's probably in pretty good shape. And so, you know, just walk your fields, look at different things, see how they feel underfoot. If you've got something like this where you've been top dressing with different materials over time, or you inherited a situation like this, how does your drainage work? Not so great. And so if you've got water moving from one layer to the next layer to the next layer, the water literally has to fill up that full layer before it'll move down to the layer below it. And then that layer to the layer below it. And so we've got multiple layers here, and water is going to slowly move down through this profile. And so how's your oxygen in your root system if the water's not moving down? Not great, right? So your root system is going to struggle. You're not going to have water moving in. You're going to have water washing off the surface a lot of times. And so we need to fix situations like that. And then excessive thatch. A lot of times with athletics, we see shearing. Athlete tries to plant, and it just shears off because of that thatch. But obviously it's a bad situation for growing grasses in anyways, because these things harbor insects and diseases. And our root system sometimes will stay up in that thatch layer if it's severe enough. You can see a bunch of roots hanging out in that layer. So, compaction, things to think about, right? So we've got hard soils, we've got less air spaces, so we've got less oxygen in the soil. Again, we need our oxygen. So we've got poor drainage. Water cannot move down through these particles if we've got them all mashed together like this. And then everybody's done this before, right? Pulled a plant out of a pot, and you see the roots are just, it's root bound, it's wrapped around itself in that pot. Same thing happens in the soil. If you've got a hard layer, the roots don't just drill through that hard layer, they'll stop and start to go sideways. They can't go through hard layers, and so we see, maybe not this excessive, but something like that. We also see weeds show up, indicator weeds, like annual bluegrass are not weed. Those grasses will grow with hard soils where our grasses are going to struggle in those. And then obviously this one needs to be probably number one for us. If a kid gets tackled or if a kid falls on this hard surface, what does that mean for me? Right? At some point, there's going to be, and I think I've even heard of things in Texas happening where some kid got injured on an athletic field and they went after the facility because the kid was injured. And so is that neglect? If you've made that field hard by not airifying it, or if you allowed that field to get hard without airifying it, I don't know. I don't know how all that stuff works, but there's likely going to be more injuries if we if we don't do something about the hardness. All right, so how do we fix it? How do we fix a hard field? Any one of these, you're golden. Every one of those is available on Amazon, so get on your phones. This is a lot cheaper than one of those fancy machines, and they work wonders. I guarantee you'll be happy with these. No, don't buy any of these. Things like this, that's pulling behind, how much weight is on that? Is it even going into the soil at all? Obviously, that's not going to do much. That might go into the soil a little bit, but what's it really doing, and how much surface area are you actually impacting with something like that? Probably not a ton. What's that? Yeah, right. Yeah, would you just stay there? Yeah, good point. This would maybe work, but how fast is that going to work? If you have an employee you hate, maybe that's the job for them. All right, so obviously we need to be thinking about other things, but a lot of times we think about these kind of machines. These aren't a whole lot better than the machines I just showed you. If your machine does not get down into the ground and just kind of rolls along the surface and only pulls out a tiny little plug, you're not doing any good. You're wasting your time. And so save up your money and your budget. Don't buy these things. Don't inherit something like this. Or if you do, explain to your boss why this is a useless piece of equipment. It just does not get into the soil like you need to get into the soil. And so we need to see something like this on our fields that are going to get down into the soil and do a good job for us. And obviously there's a whole bunch of different brands that make these things, and there's a whole bunch of different ones that are really good. But as long as they're slamming a tine into the ground, you're in pretty good shape. So lots of benefits with aerification. Water moving in, water moving through the soil. We've got oxygen in the soil. We get gases out. We get thatch that we're literally pulling out of the soil with this machine, and we're pulling compaction out as well. So because of those things, we have an increase in rooting. So our plants are healthier. But things to think about that are obviously concerns for us, you're going to rip up your surface. And so is this something that you're going to do right before a big game or a tournament or whatever? Right, you can't. And so a lot of the things that we do in turf management aren't the best agronomic practices. They are practices that we have to do to get around the sports that are on our field. And so, a lot of times we're doing these things in the off season, even if it's not ideal time of the year. A lot of damage, right? A lot of stress. This is a huge stress to our plants. And so with the warm season grass, what's the ideal time to be doing this? If it's a warm season grass, yeah. So when it's warm, right? So when that grass can recover. With a cool season, when it's cooler. We don't want to do when the grass is under huge stress in the summertime. We don't want to hammer it with aerification. And sometimes we have to because of the season. Because of whenever our sports are being played on it. But it's just not ideal. If you're going in at the same depth year after year after year, say it's a 4-inch tine and that's the only machine that you have, you can get a cultivation pan. It's just a hard layer where those tines hit year after year after year. And so you get that hard layer at 4 inches. What happens to our roots? They hit that and stop, right? And so every once in a while, if you've only got that 4-inch tine, get somebody in there with a deep tine machine that can break up that soil. Weed seeds can be brought to the surface. To me, that's not as big of a deal as some of these other ones. And then cores. Do you harvest the cores off? If you do, what do you do with them? I'm a huge fan of just busting them up and top dressing with the material that you pulled out of the field. It's full of microbes. It's the same material that you've got there. And it's the cheapest and easiest thing to do. All right, so a lot of this should go without saying, but I've got to say it because I've been in enough shops across the country to know that there are pieces of equipment that are good equipment, but they're either being not maintained properly or, in this case, tines are not being replaced. Tines wear down, right? And so we've got to change them out to make sure that we're getting the impact that we want. So we want a lot of holes. We want to use big tines if we can. If you've got a big game coming up, do you want to use the biggest tine you can? No. If you have to punch a hole right before an event, you want to use as small a tine as possible just to vent that out or whatever you need to do. You want to get into the soil, obviously, and not use one of those cheap machines. Good tines, and then you've got to do this. This is over and over and over again, because as soon as you take that machine off and the next machine goes on to mow or spray or whatever's going on, and the kids get on there, what happens with your compaction? starts to build back up. And so you have to do this over and over and over again. And then your goal, ideally, is 20% surface disruption per year, which if you think about it is a massive amount of holes. And so if you try to do this in one shot, you'd be doing like quarter-inch spacing kind of thing, going extremely slow, which is just not possible. So if you had 2-inch spacings with like quarter-inch tines or half-inch tines, you'd still probably have to go over it about 4 times to get 20% in a year. So it's a lot of aerification, but on our athletic fields that are excessively used, it's probably what we need. All right, nutrients. All right, this is one of those things that we've got to think about because nutrients are on the chopping block. Fertilizers are on the chopping block. All right, so our grass plant, whole bunch of water depending on time of year and the kind of grass it is, either 75 to 85% water. The rest of it is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and our macronutrients out of the soil like nitrogen, potassium, and sulfur, and our micros. And some of these micros and even our macronutrients sometimes get bound up in the soil, hard to release depending on kind of soil you have, what's the pH, et cetera, et cetera. And so your soil test might show you that, oh, there's lots of these things in there, but they're just not available to the plant. And so those are things that we need to think about. So here's one that may be a little bit, I feel strongly about this, but other people feel strongly the other way, and I'll just leave it at that. But so when you apply fertilizer, the best way that plant has to take that fertilizer into the plant is through its root system. That's what the root system is designed to do, is to find water, bring water into the plant, and find nutrients, and bring nutrients into the plant. There are root hairs on roots that just make a massive surface area through the soil to find nutrients and water. All right, what about foliar feeding? Is there anything wrong with foliar feeding if you're just spraying nutrients on the leaf and not watering them in? Is the leaf a good way to get nutrients into the plant? So a lot of times it depends on the product that we're using. And so some of the molecules are just too large to get into the leaf. But a lot of the times we see a nutrient that does get into the leaf, it goes there and stays. Whereas the nutrients that are brought in from the root system will move wherever in the plant. And so, yes, you can get nutrients through the leaf, but it's much more efficient to get the nutrients through the root system. And so what I would recommend, I'm totally fine with spraying nutrients on. Absolutely, you're going to get great coverage with something like that. But water them in, and then let the roots do what they're designed to do. If you've got a situation like that field that I'm consulting on, where it's 100% sand, these foliar feedings with small amounts of nutrients are things to think about, right? Because there's nothing to hold those nutrients in the soil. And so situations like that, think about what do I have versus what should I be doing with to manage this. All right, so do you need to fertilize? What about it? Do you need to fertilize? Yes, no, maybe? Probably, right? Probably. At least at some point you're going to have to. Right? But this is one of those things to pay attention to. So I am not a soil fertility expert by any means at all, but a good buddy of mine is, and I learn from this guy all the time. And I was just talking with him the other week, and he said, you know, I've stopped recommending soil testing. And I was like, what? I've pushed soil testing for the last 20-some years. Why don't you want soil testing? He said, well, because all the recommendations on a soil test are based off of forages and corn and wheat. And they're looking for yield, whereas we're looking for strength and surviving through the year. And so the recommendations that you're getting on a soil test don't mean a whole lot for us. And so that's why he's like, you know what, I'm just kind of over soil testing. And I was like, okay, that just blew my mind a little bit. But, you know, it makes some sense what he's saying. So when we think about what should our soils have in them, we need to think about, well, what are we growing on? If it's a sandy medium that doesn't hold a lot of nutrients, you're probably going to have to fertilize more than a good soil like that. That's going to hold on to a lot of nutrients. But pay attention, right? If you've got all sorts of clippings coming off of that field, is your grass happy? If it's growing like crazy, There's getting nutrients and stuff from somewhere, right? And so if you're getting this kind of volume of clippings out when you're mowing, you don't need to be fertilizing as much. And that's one of the things we see with athletic fields and golf courses and especially home lawns is that we're typically overdoing it with our fertilizer. And so pay attention to your clippings to figure out what should I be doing. And then which products. So I'm a huge believer in ag-based products. Cheap. And I'm a cheap guy, and I'll admit that. And that's part of it, right? I just don't want to spend my money on expensive fertilizers. Is there anything wrong with ag versus expensive turf fertilizers? No, they're both good products. Things to think about, though. Ag fertilizers will typically burn your turf if you don't get them watered in. Ag fertilizers are a big prill size, and if you've got a short-cut grass, they're going to give you spotting. They're not going to cover very well versus a small particle size fertilizer. What about slow releases? Anybody using slow release products? Yeah, so I like slow release products. I have no problem with them, especially at different times of the year when I can just avoid getting out there and just put the product down and let it feed for a number of months. That's fantastic. Obviously more money, but it could save you time and money with applications. And then additional products. So there's all sorts of products out there that have amino acids and sugars and all sorts of things that are in the jug. What about those? I know they're being applied. I know they're being sold. But should we be applying these things? My kind of take on these things is, you know what, if you're doing everything else right and you're fertilizing to what the plant needs, if you want to put on other things to, feel like it's a kind of a safety net for you, do what you want. If you can afford it in your budget and stuff, do what you want to. But the plant needs only what it needs, and it's just the basic nutrients. And then timing, obviously, that's a big factor. If we're dealing with warm season grasses, what's our best timing for fertilizer? During the growing season, right? So spring through fall. Most of that should be on the front end, though, and start to back off as we get closer to the fall season. With our cool season grasses, when do we want to think about fertilizing them? Spring and fall, all right, when they're growing the most. Should you fertilize at all with your cool season grasses in the summertime? It depends. How about that? So if it's irrigated and if you go gentle on how much nutrients you're putting out there, maybe that's okay. But if you're going heavy with, pound of nitrogen, you're probably going to zap some grass. Remember, we got photorespiration happening in the summertime. The cool season grasses aren't growing near as much as in the spring and the fall. They're struggling. And so if you zap them, it's just another stress that's going on them. So most of them will go out in the fall, a little bit in the spring, and then very little, maybe just to maintain some color and a little bit of growth in the summertime. And then sometimes your grass just talks to you, right? There's something wrong. The color's off. Whatever the deal is, right? You got to start figuring out, why is my color off, right? So this was on a field in Mississippi, and the field manager went out there with ammonium nitrate, nothing. And usually that's the fix, right? Throw nitrogen, it's going to green up. Did nothing. Ammonium sulfate, though, obviously this soil was deficient in sulfur. Greened it up immediately. And so, that was just kind of a lucky guess that they made there. But, pay attention to those things that, why does my grass look rough? What could I be lacking? And then that's where maybe a soil test can help you. Is something lacking? And so like I was just saying, is soil testing a good thing? I still kind of think it is, to at least give you a baseline of what's going on, right? And if you've got problems, by all means, do a soil test to figure out, am I lacking something? Even if the recommendations don't mean anything to me, am I lacking something in the soil? And then if you've got sand, obviously pay more attention to these things than if you've got native soil because of what we've talked about already, and then keep up with it. So things to look for on your soil test report. Your pH. Most of the time we want to be in that 6 to 6.5 range. Salts. If you've got crazy high levels of salts, your grass is going to struggle. And that's one of the things. If I have grass that's struggling, then I'll look for, what are my salt levels? And so I was consulting on another place in Louisiana, and obviously there's salt intrusion in Louisiana, and the sodium absorption ratio was off the charts, and the grass just couldn't keep up with how much sodium was in the soil. The recommendations, like I've said, I don't know what to think about those. They're, take them with a grain of salt is all I can say with those. They're just not for turf plants. And then organic, I like organic in the soil, obviously, and then we're getting some free fertilizer as the organic breaks down from microbes throughout the growing season. Now here's why pH matters to us. You've all seen this chart before, but if we get too low of pH or too high a pH, nutrients just get tied up and are unavailable to the plant to use. And so even though you might do a soil test and there's a whole bunch of phosphorus there or potassium there or whatever the case is, if your pH is too far out of whack one way or the other, the plant just can't get it. It's tied up. All right. Really quickly on irrigation. So the top right photo there, what do you see? So this was my home lawn. We've got footprinting, right? What causes footprinting? Drought, so dry conditions. And so I've got turgor listed here as one of the things to think about with irrigation. Turgor is just how much water's in the cell. If a grass plant is turgid, it's standing up, and when you step on it, it goes down and bounces right back up. If it's flaccid, if there's not enough water in the cell, it lays down, and we see footprinting. And so that's one of the first things to look for if you're dealing with a drought or if you're dealing with grass that needs to be irrigated, am I leaving footprints? Photosynthesis, we've talked about. We've got to have water for that. Cooling, just like water evaporates off of your arm when you sweat, cools you down, the same thing with plants. Water moves up through the roots, into the leaves, out those stomates on the bottom side of the leaf, and evaporates out and cools the plant down. Really important. Solute movement, so nutrients moving up through the system as well, and then seeds have to have a level of water to bring into them to get them to wake up to start germinating. So water, obviously very important. A lot of things can go on when we're talking about water, and roots obviously are our biggest issue with what can limit water absorption. So how long the roots are, how vigorously spread out they are, and then how vigorously growing they are. Soil type, again, is it a sandy soil that doesn't hold water? That's going to affect water absorption. Water moving into the soil, again, a clay soil versus a sandy soil. If there's no water moving in, plants are going to struggle. Oxygen, obviously, we talked about that a whole bunch with root growth. And then, so these are things that you can deal with. A lot of this is dealt with proper aerification. So, a whole bunch of things that will cause short root systems, a whole bunch of things, and a lot of them are things that we do. So, we just talked about nitrogen in the summertime. If you go heavy with your nitrogen in the summertime when that plant's not happy, you're going to limit that root system even more than it already is limited. Obviously, something we don't want to do. Drainage, obviously, because there's just no oxygen. Thatch, the roots are growing in the thatch. Compaction, we've talked about. Short mowing height. The shorter that you mow, the shorter your root system is. Pretty simple. And so if we can raise that mowing height up a little bit, we're going to have a whole bunch of benefits. Acid soils, injuries from whatever the case is, and then high temperatures, all of those things will give us short root systems. And I'm running out of time, so I need to kind of zip through what I've got left here. This is kind of our perfect situation. Field capacity, that's kind of where we would like our soil to be pretty much all the time. There's oxygen spaces, there's water in that soil, our plants are in good shape. That's what we want to see. But to get to this, we need to fill the soil up completely with water, so basically to the point where there's standing water starting on the surface. Let that excess drain down to leave us with this. And then as the plant uses this water and as it evaporates out of the soil, we get to this wilting point. And then when we get to that wilting point where we're seeing those footprints, fill it back up and go through the whole system again. Instead of watering lightly every day or every couple of days or whatever, go with that deep and infrequent system because of this is what we want. A vigorous, deep root system that we're going to have with that deep and infrequent irrigation. Obviously, if we're doing different types of irrigation, the roots are going to struggle, means the plants are going to struggle. If you've got this, so, I mean, we've already talked about water as one of those things that people are after. And if people are going by public spaces or fields that show all of that, how good does that look for all of us? Really bad. and it makes them want to go after us even more. And so pay attention to those things. Don't let that stuff happen. But obviously our morning is the best time to water for diseases and the best use of the water, and obviously there's no people out there. Pay attention to your soil moisture, like we've talked about already, just to see, is it moist enough for my plants to do its thing. And I'm going to flip past that just to speed things along here. So mowing, obviously very important for a lot of reasons. We need our surface to be playable, we need it to look good, and we want as dense as possible. And I want to show this picture. This is the exact same kind of tall fescue, the same cultivar. I just mowed it at two different heights. Which one looks better, 3.5 or 1? 1. Why? So it's more dense, right? Way more plants on the right than on the left. What else? Color's better for sure. What about the leaf size? Smaller leaves. And so when we mow low, we get good things like this. All of these different things. We get more chlorophyll, and that's why we're getting darker green. But we also have issues when we mow low as well. Less rhizomes, less roots, and less sugars being produced. So it looks great, but you're going to have to do more work the shorter that you mow your grass. And so if you can mow your grasses a little bit higher, you're going to have a healthier plant that's easier to maintain and less dependent on chemicals. The 1/3 mowing law that you've all heard about, never remove more than 1/3 of the leaf at one time before, came from this research from 1950. Really simple research, but really good stuff. If you mow more than 1/3 off at one time, you're going to be in rough shape. I've got, what, 2 minutes? 2 minutes, easy. I've got like 25 slides left. Piece of cake. Sharp mower is obviously important for a lot of reasons too, but the big one for me is diseases can get in easier if you've got jaggedy looking leaf tips like that. Grass seeds, things to think about when you're planting. So all of the stored energy in that seed is in this endosperm section. All right, and so if we plant our seed in the ground, we've got water starts coming in, the seed starts waking up, starts to germinate. You've got that much energy stored in that seed for that plant to make it from wherever that seed is to the surface. If it runs out, what happens to that seedling? Dead, right? So if you've got tiny little seeds like bluegrasses and Bermuda grass is one of the small ones down here too, you can't plant those things deep or else they're not going to make it to the surface. So you want seed soil contact, but you just don't go crazy with getting them too deep. So for germination, we've got to have moisture, oxygen, and temperature. Usually it's warmer is good. And then after they germinate, think about keeping it moist and making sure that there's nutrients. When you're planting though, don't just sling a starter fertilizer because there's no roots there to take up that fertilizer. Wait till the plant is actually growing to start fertilizing. All right, pest management, this is what I want to end up on. All right, so if you're doing all of these things properly, you're mowing properly, you're air fying, you're thinking about all of those things. This is our goal, right? As thick a possible turf that we can get. If you've got this thick a turf, how are weeds going to germinate and make it up in something like that? Pretty tough, right? Compare that to this, where we've had a disease thin the grass out, and you can see that light colored grass in there is crabgrass. The rest of it's Bermuda grass. All right, so that's obviously something we want to think about. But with healthy turf, you've all seen this disease triangle before. The healthier our turf is, we're going to take the susceptible host out of the equation. And so we cannot have disease if all three of these things are not present. So this might be there, the environment may be right, but if that's gone, it doesn't matter. All right, so the goal obviously is to take these signs out of our equation so we can just have our healthy grass, our thick grass, without a whole bunch of pesticide use. All right, and that's my time. I appreciate everybody coming this morning.